The name of this teaching actually encompasses more than is apparent from its title. To someone not versed in Platypus, its activities and pedagogy, you might have turned up today expecting a simple lecture on the history of capitalism, the emergence of the power of the bourgeoisie, and the domination of the proletariat. I'm certainly going to try and deal with all that, but the question of capital in history actually asks an accompanying question about the left in history. I saw it said recently that Platypus doesn't really have a line on politics, and it doesn't, purposefully, but it does have a line on history. To quote Chris Cutrone in the essay from which this teaching takes its name, we in Platypus focus on the history of the left because we think that the narrative one tells about this history is in fact one's theory of the present, implicitly or explicitly in one's conception of the history of the left, is an account of how the present came to be. By focusing on the history of the left, or by adopting a left-centric view of history, we hypothesize that the most important determinations of the present are the result of what the left has done or failed to do historically. It's quite telling that these are Cutrone's opening remarks in an essay entitled Capital in History. And it's a good way of introducing Platypus itself and its left-centric focus on history. This theory of history, and therefore of the present, is the justification for what Platypus has been trying to do over the past nearly two decades of its existence. So Platypus started in Chicago in late 2004, initially as a journal founded by students of the late Professor Moshe Postone, a veteran of the 1960s New Left. Following the anti-war movements that sprang up around the Iraq War, Platypus would develop into a reading group in early 2006 before the Platypus Affiliated Society itself was established later that year. It set out as a critical project around the then growing millennial left, seeking to interrogate the potential for emancipatory politics and the reconstitution of a Marxian left. We seek to host the conversation on the left and investigate the problems and tasks inherited from the old 20s to 30s, new 60s to 70s, and post-political 80s to 90s left, and perhaps now the millennial left too. It's Platypus's contention that our present world and the present state of the left is constituted by the failure of Marxism to change the world, and the continued inability of the ostensibly Marxian left to surmount that failure, and in so doing affirming the course of history and contributing to the reconstitution of capitalism. We, our world, we on the left, indeed we in Platypus, are products of failure. We contend that the left, that is Marxism, the most profound political project for changing the world that there has ever been, is dead. But it is not simply dead and gone. Somehow it still seems to task us. As Cutrone explains in his rejoinder to the philosopher Alain Badiou, the Marxist hypothesis, this left-centric view of history is motivated by the need for what Karl Korsch called the historical materialist analysis and critique of Marxism itself, or a Marxist history and theory of Marxism. This would be a history of the emergence, crisis, and decline of Marxism as expressing the possibility of getting beyond capital, as Marx and the best Marxists understood this. Today, as opposed to Korsch's time in 1923, this would include consideration of the possibility that the potential Marxism expressed missed its chance and has carried on only in a degenerate, spectral way, until passing effectively into history. That such an account is possible at all is what motivates the fundamental hypothesis of Marxism, or the Marxist hypothesis. The hypothesis that Marxism, as a perspective in politics, could be the vital nerve centre of modern history. For Marxism is the grandest of all grand narratives of history, with reason. Today, the question is, what was Marxism? The accompaniment to the claim that the left is dead, and the part of our slogan that many seem to miss, is the cry of long live the left. The question of what it would take to reconstitute a Marxian left, even to transcend Marxism and allow the left to live once more, is bound up with the present situation of the dead left, of which Platypus considers itself both a part and a symptom. The dead left seems unable to transcend itself and its history because the failure of Marxism has yet to be truly contended with. Platypus wants to, at the very least, host the conversation that might bring the ideological obstacles born out of that failure to the fore. To narrativize this history is already somewhat dubious, precisely because of our perspective on history, our theory of history. But I do think it's important to relay the history of capital, or the rising importance of capital in history, with which the emergence of the left was bound up. This will go some way to answering the question of what capitalism is, or was, for Marxism, and what we in Platypus understand by capital and the left. Society, as the Frankfurt School critical theorist Theodore W. Adorno put it, is a concept of the third estate. As Catrone explains in his essay Class Consciousness from a Marxist Perspective Today, modern bourgeois society, or the society of the modern city, is the product of the revolt of the third estate, or commoners, who had no property other than that of their labour, self-made men. During the French Revolution, the third estate separated itself from the other estates of the clergy and aristocracy and declared itself the National Assembly. Unlike the previous ancient civilization, in which people were divinely ordered in a great chain of being, the third estate put forward the idea that people would relate to one another on the basis of their work or their activity in society, which would find purchase not in a strict hierarchy of traditional values, but rather through a free market of goods. People would be free to find their own values in society. Bourgeois society first really emerges in the Renaissance, but finds its political realization with the revolt of the third estate. Labour, then, for bourgeois thinkers, was conceived as an exercise in freedom, as indeed the means of the realization of freedom, of the emancipatory potential granted by society. Labour was taken to be the means of social transformation, the freedom not simply to be, but to become. For bourgeois thinkers, the social dynamic, the transformative potential of labour, unfettered from feudal exploitation, was one of increasing perfectibility, the perfectibility of freedom, and the growing maturation and enlightenment of society. And history, for Hegel, the apotheotic bourgeois philosopher, was precisely the history of the unfolding and coming to consciousness of freedom. First, bourgeois society discovered, beginning with Kant and through to Hegel, history, its own historiosity. The notion of the withering away of the state, for example, associated so strongly today with Marxism, was an idea that emerged in radical bourgeois thought and was conceived of as a very real possibility. In an interview that Platypus member Danny Jacobs conducted with David McGregor, author of the books The Communist Ideal in Hegel and Marx, Hegel, Marx and the English State, and Hegel and Marx After the Fall of Communism, McGregor remarks that he was surprised to find that when he, Hegel, was about 23, he and the poet Hölderlin had decided that the state would disappear and be replaced by poetry. This emergent consciousness of freedom was bound up with the unfettered productive capacity of mankind. This, they thought, had the potential to, at the very least, considerably shorten the hours allotted to labour, and even to realise the principle more commonly associated with Marxism of to each according to his ability, to each according to his need. There's a passage in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations that really shines a light on the spirit of the age. So Smith writes, "In the first fire engines, that is, steam engines, a boy was constantly employed to open and shut alternately the communication between the boiler and the cylinder, according as the piston either ascended or descended. One of those boys, who loved to play with his companions, observed that by tying a string from the handle of the valve which opened this communication to another part of the machine, the valve would open and shut without his assistance, and leave him at liberty to divert himself with his playfellows. One of the greatest improvements that has been made upon this machine since it was first invented was in this manner the discovery of a boy who wanted to save his own labour." But when we look around today at the world we all inhabit, it's difficult to say with Hegel that history is the history of the unfolding of freedom, and that the slaughter bench of history is therefore meaningful in this sense. That no longer seems to be the case. Instead of perfecting freedom, the history of capitalism, or at least after the failure of Marxism, seems instead to be the history of perfecting domination, with emancipation left incomplete, unrealised, and past failures seeming only to ruffle the fabric of the progress of the victors, of the ruling class. Not freedom, but capital, is the culmination of world history as domination, and the object of the labours of mankind, although it might also express its potential overcoming. So what do we understand by the term capital? While, as Catrone remarks, prior forms of civilization knew overt domination of some social groups over others, they did not know a social dynamic to which all social groups are subject. Rather than simply being yet another form of exploitation, to which it is not reducible, capitalism bespeaks domination by a reified, that is thingified, an anonymous social dynamic that is the product and aim of labour. When we talk about capital, then, we're not talking about money or wealth or capitalists, but a contradictory, self-undermining social relation that in turn dominates the society that produces it. This is why Platypus insists on a distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism. It's not a clear-cut distinction. We still live in bourgeois society, albeit reproduced in capitalist form, but we understand capitalism as the self-contradiction, the self-negation of bourgeois society through its process of realisation, its paradoxical historical dynamic. The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, the year of the American Revolution. Catrone remarks that at the same time that this modern bourgeois society ratcheted into high gear by the late 18th century, it entered into crisis, and a new, unprecedented historical phenomenon was manifested in political life, the left. While earlier forms of politics certainly disputed values, this was not in terms of historical progress, which became the hallmark of the left. The Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century, the introduction of machine production, was accompanied by the optimistic and exhilarating socialist utopias suggested by these new developments, pointing to fantastical possibilities expressed in the imaginations of Fourier and Saint-Simon, among others. Utopian socialism then was born out of the development of bourgeois society and the advent of the Industrial Revolution, with machine production revealing possibilities hitherto undreamed of. Utopian socialism was a phenomenon of bourgeois society, of its development, so too the left. It was these early pangs of this crisis and contradiction, the yet unrealized potential of bourgeois society in its revolt, and the concomitant demands for the so-called social republic made by the emergent industrial working class and the associated socialist movements, that the young Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels set out to critically investigate. As Catrone has it, Marx was not simply the best or most consistent radical socialist, but rather the most historically and hence critically self-aware. Marx was the foremost critic of socialism. Rather than utopian socialism, but through their critique of it as a phenomenon and symptom of bourgeois society and capitalism in crisis, Marx and Engels developed scientific socialism. By this should be understood that the conditions of possibility and necessity for socialism were discovered in capitalism itself. Thus, Marx and Engels were not anti-capitalists in the way we might imagine today. They were not romantics, they were not railing against monopolization, colonialism, and the growing domination of capital in the name of some earlier epoch. Rather, in these developments and in the emergence of the left, Marx and Engels discovered that the dynamic of bourgeois society itself was tending towards the necessity of its own transcendence. As stated, bourgeois society was to be a society of free labourers, each owning their own means of production and the product of their labour. As the philosopher John Locke put it, labour was the first property. The idea of private property was actually derived from labour rather than set up against it, and was conceived as a means not of domination and exploitation, but of emancipation for the labouring commoners from the unjust expropriation of their labour by the clergy and aristocracy. But it was becoming clear to Marx and Engels by the 1840s, the time of the first global crisis of capital dubbed the Hungry Forties, that the vaunted dynamic of bourgeois society was coming into contradiction with itself and producing a new social class. Really the first social class as we understand the concept today, the proletariat. As far as bourgeois society is concerned, the proletariat, the subjective form of labour sans property, labour estranged from its product as capital, as a commodity, is a contradiction in terms. It is propertyless labour. This is why Marx, after the liberal economist and historian Jean-Charles Leonard de Sismondi, used the term that once referred to a social class of propertyless Roman citizens. The opposing bourgeoisie, then, the owners of industrial capital, were what Marx termed the non-working owners, the character masks of capital as against labour. The class of the proletariat is not only a contradiction in terms as far as bourgeois society is concerned, it is the living self-negation of bourgeois society, produced from out of its own dynamic, a dynamic to which the proletariat is not internal, but integral. What does this mean? The proletariat is not only the negation of capitalism as a fixed and static phenomenon, but drives the continued and abortive self-abolition of capitalism through the production of surplus value that domination by capital demands, and indeed negates itself as what Marx terms a living commodity. The uptick in productive capacity achieved during the Industrial Revolution served to undermine the social value of labour of the individual worker. So this is the negative realisation of Smith's hopes. The devaluation of labour means that less socially necessary labour is actually necessary, but as the director of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, put it, machines made not work, but the workers superfluous. Marx recognised in Capital a problem in history sui generis and identified the first crisis of overproduction in human history, a crisis not foreseen by early bourgeois thinkers, and bringing with it brand new possibilities both for emancipation and domination. Proletarianised labour undermines and devalues itself precisely through its own labour, its own social activity. The proletariat unconsciously enacts this self-abolition without realising it politically, and therefore without overcoming it. The potential for emancipation becomes a new form of suffering. Marx and Marxism, through enacting the imminent dialectical critique of bourgeois society, embodied the consciousness of its necessarily transitory character, of the necessity of its overcoming, and of the self-abolition of the proletariat as that class's historical task. Imminent critique here means measuring it against its own concept and discovering through its contradiction how bourgeois society points beyond itself. Bourgeois social relations have themselves become a fetter on the productive capacity of humanity. Bourgeois society in capitalism has forgotten that the aim of production was to be freedom in transformation, the freedom to become. Instead, humanity has come to serve capital. Capital in the form of industrial capital becomes not a means of social transformation, but the end goal of production. Means and ends are reversed, which is one of the ways in which Georg Lukács, in History and Class Consciousness, understands reification. In the Grundriss, Marx explains that the ancient conception in which man always appears in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition as the aim of production seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth, if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature, as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which makes the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality? Where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration seeks for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or, where it appears to be satisfied with itself, is vulgar and mean. Let's make sure this is still online. Seems to be. Okay. Marx and Engels famously remark in the Communist Manifesto of 1848 that history is the history of class struggles. Given that bourgeois society failed to produce the classless society envisioned by its most radical thinkers, it could be said to have produced its own opposite, precisely the opposite of what had been intended by the revolt of the Third Estate, a new class society, perhaps the perfection of the class domination that had always existed in some form and as potential. Thus, as Adorno writes in Reflections on Class Theory, according to Marxist theory, history is the history of class struggles. But the concept of class is bound up with the emergence of the proletariat. Even when it was still revolutionary, the bourgeoisie called itself the Third Estate. By extending the concept of class to prehistory, theory denounces not just the bourgeois, whose freedom together with their possessions and education perpetuates the tradition of the old injustice, it also turns against prehistory itself. It destroys the illusion of a good-natured patriarchy that had been assumed by prehistory following the victory of inexorable capitalist circulation. The venerable unity of a traditional structure, the natural right of hierarchy in a society that was presented as having grown organically, turned out to be a unity of interested parties. That hierarchy had always been a coercive organisation designed for the appropriation of the labour of others. Natural law is historical injustice that has become obsolete. The articulated organism is a system of divisiveness. The picture of the estates is the ideology that, with the themes of honest merit, loyal work, and lastly, the exchange of equivalents, was ideally suited to the newly installed bourgeoisie. By exposing the historical necessity that has brought capitalism into being, political economy became the critique of history as a whole, whose immutable nature was the source of the privileged status of capitalism as well as its forebears. To recognise the catastrophic violence in the latest form of injustice, the latent injustice contained in fair exchange, means simply to identify it with the prehistory that it destroyed. If all the oppression that man has ever inflicted on man culminates in the cold inhumanity of free wage labour, then the past is revealed in conditions and things, the romantic contrast to industrial reason, as the trace of former suffering. The archaic silence of the pyramids and ruins becomes conscious of itself in materialist thought. It is the echo of factory noise in the landscape of the immutable. Yet Jacob Burckhardt has as the suggestion that the parable of the cave in Plato's Republic, with its sublime symbolism of the doctrine of eternal ideas, derived from the horrendous image of the Athenian silver mines. This implies that the philosophical ideas of eternal truth had sprung from the contemplation of present torment. All history is the history of class struggles because it was always the same thing, namely prehistory. So the self-dissolution of bourgeois society and capitalism, embodied by the proletariat, bears emancipatory potential, points beyond class society, beyond labour as a social relation, and therefore not simply beyond capitalism in the way that bourgeois society emerged from out of traditional civilization. Insofar as bourgeois society and capitalism is convicted of being simply the latest form of human prehistory, capitalism has come to point beyond human prehistory, i.e. beyond class society, towards history proper. Human destiny consciously driven by humanity, socialised as we are already compelled to be by capitalism. As Catrone puts it, with Marx in the 19th century came the realisation that bourgeois society, along with its categories of subjectivity including the valorisation of labour, might itself be transitional, that the end goal of humanity might not be found in the productive individual of bourgeois theory and practice, but that this society might point beyond itself, towards a potential qualitative transformation at least as profound as that which separated the peasant way of life from the urban proletarian one, indeed transition more on the order of profundity of the Neolithic revolution in agriculture that ended hunter-gatherer society 10,000 years ago, more profound than that which separated modern from traditional society. It was recognised then that the proletariat would have to both fulfil, positively realise, and negate capitalism and itself as itself the negation of bourgeois society and therefore of all prior prehistory. For instance, the expropriation of the means of production by the proletariat would be part of the simultaneous realisation and abolition, Selbstaufhebung, of itself as a commodity, at first by being able, say, to set the terms of the sale of its own labour, and later by transcending the exchange principle through fulfilling it in the expropriation of capital. In this sense, one aspect of class consciousness is the self-consciousness of the proletariat as itself a living commodity. The negation itself has to be positively realised, and it is precisely in this process of self-negation that Marx and Engels discover the necessity and the conditions of possibility for socialism. When we say, therefore, that capitalism is the conditions of possibility for socialism, this is meant to include the existence of the proletariat as the bearer of that possibility. The emergent workers' movement necessitated the development of the left in a proletarian socialist direction. The development and history of capital and its dialectical opposite, labour, is bound up with the development and history of the left. The crisis in society, exemplified by the class struggle between capitalists and proletarians, came once more to necessitate state intervention. Here we were talking about this a little earlier. The state, as envisaged by the likes of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in whom Hegel claimed freedom first came to self-consciousness, was to be the guarantor of civil liberties and the general will, meaning the preservation of society. Society, for Rousseau, while keeping human beings in chains, also granted them freedoms beyond natural liberty as a result of their being chained. People are compelled to be free. The general will, then, society, was more than the sum of its parts. It was not simply the accumulation of all the individual wills in society, or a kind of happy medium of all those wills, but the will of society itself to survive and preserve the freedom of individual subjects, where the production of the social individual was still taken to be the purpose of society. The state stepping into the fray during the crisis of society in the mid-19th century, while a regression in terms of the horizon of possibility for society, was also a product of that society's simultaneous need to both preserve and transcend itself. It can be seen as the self-contradiction and disintegration of the general will itself, insofar as real bourgeois liberties were sacrificed for the sake of their formal preservation. This is most prominently described by Marx and Engels, as far as I've read, in The Class Struggles in France 1848 to 1850, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written from 1851 to 2, and The Civil War in France, written in 1871. In his 1891 postscript to the Civil War in France, Engels describes the changes that had taken place in the bourgeois form of the state. He writes, society had created its own organs to look after its common interests, originally through simple division of labour. But these organs, at whose head was the state power, had in the course of time, in pursuance of their own special interests, transformed themselves from the servants of society into the masters of society, as can be seen not only in the hereditary monarchy, but equally also in the democratic republic. This transformation of the state was described by Marx and Marxism, therefore, as Bonapartism, after the rule of the Second Empire by Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon I. The task of Bonapartism was to mediate and find compromise between the two warring classes, and ultimately to put down the proletariat in any uprising, thus ensuring the preservation of bourgeois society in capitalist form. Bourgeois society then had reneged on its own promise, not by abandoning its own premise, but through the course of its development, through its coming to be itself, through fulfilling itself. A development driven by the industrial proletariat who were not merely its extraneous victims. To put it in a kind of playfully dialectical way, in becoming more bourgeois, in becoming itself, it negated itself, became less bourgeois in capitalism. The more bourgeois it became, the less bourgeois it became. Capitalism is statism. As Marx wrote in The Class Struggles in France, Louis Bonaparte as against the Constituent National Assembly, that was not one universal power as against another. That was not one unilateral constitutional power as against another. That was not the executive power as against the legislative. That was the constituted bourgeois republic itself as against the instruments of its own constitution, as against the ambitious intrigues and ideological demands of the revolutionary faction of the bourgeoisie that had founded it, and was now amazed to find that its constituted republic looked like a restored monarchy, and now desired forcibly to prolong the constituent period with its conditions, its illusions, its language, and its personages, and to prevent the mature bourgeois republic from emerging in its complete and peculiar form. The horizon of the possibility for this society regressed under the domination of capital. With the crisis of society in full swing, the bourgeoisie had retreated under the coattails of Louis Napoleon. It was left to the workers' movement for socialism, the left, to take up the cause of freedom now abandoned by the bourgeoisie. Indeed, implicit in what Marx is saying here is the necessity of carrying through the revolution begun by the revolt of the Third Estate, whose secret telos is proletarian revolution. Socialism was conceived by Marx as a one-sided negation of capitalism, as its dialectical opposite, as the negation that capitalism already is, positively realized. It was to be the means of passing through and beyond the necessity of bourgeois right into freedom. Without that, the dialectic of bourgeois society and capitalism culminates in a constituted republic that, quote, looked like a restored monarchy, desirous only of fixing upon and preserving the constituent period and its attendant liberties, without recognizing the necessity of their passing away. As Marx puts it in The Civil War in France, the empire, with the coup d'etat for its birth certificate, universal suffrage for its sanction, and the sword for its sceptre, professed to rest upon the peasantry, the large mass of producers not directly involved in the struggle of capital and labour. It professed to save the working class by breaking down parliamentarism, and with it the undisguised subserviency of government to the property classes. It professed to save the property classes by upholding their economic supremacy over the working class. And finally, it professed to unite all classes by reviving for all the chimera of national glory. In reality, it was the only form of government possible at a time when the bourgeoisie had already lost and the working class had not yet acquired the faculty of ruling the nation. It was acclaimed throughout the world as the saviour of society. Under its sway, bourgeois society, freed from political cares, attained a development unexpected even by itself. Its industry and commerce expanded to colossal dimensions. Financial swindling celebrated cosmopolitan orgies. The misery of the masses was set off by a shameless display of gorgeous, meretricious, and debased luxury. The state power apparently soaring high above society in the very hotbed of all its corruptions. Just as for Marxism, socialism is the dialectical opposite of capitalism, so the dictatorship of the proletariat was conceived in contradistinction to the Bonapartist form of rule and is best understood as its dialectical opposite. In other words, both the Bonapartist state and the dictatorship of the proletariat emerge under the compulsion of a necessity issuing from society itself, from the crisis of society, class struggle, and the concomitant regression to the need for political rule. Thus, the dictatorship of the proletariat can, in a certain sense, be understood as a regression from the horizon of bourgeois emancipation, insofar as it has a necessarily authoritarian aspect, while also far outstripping that horizon. Bonapartism answers this same necessity, but can be described as the right wing of this tendency. It acts only to preserve what is, not to realise what ought to be. In our main syllabus in Platypus, we read a text by Leszek Kolakowski, The Concept of the Left. For Kolakowski, what separates left from right is not progressivism versus reaction. Rather, the left seeks to make good on new possibilities, and in so doing, the idea of utopia becomes itself a tool, while the right seeks to conserve what already exists, foreclosing further possibilities. The Bonapartist state no longer has its sights set on its eventual withering away, but resigns itself but resigns itself to be the continued need for the power of the state over society, the continued need for the governing of people, rather than setting its sights and consigning that state of affairs to the history books and existing only for the sake of the administration of things. The movement for socialism was the attempt to get beyond class society as such through realizing and transcending the self-abolition of the proletariat, the realization of the negation through the negation of the negation of the proletarianization of society. The dictatorship of the proletariat must therefore be understood not as a permanent state of affairs in which the proletariat would install itself as a new and permanent ruling class, but as far as Marxism was concerned, only a temporary measure used to suppress the capitalist class and secure the gains of the revolution, just as the Bonapartist state is and was. I need to click that quickly. It's going to make that noise again. That was Patrick. Where am I up to? For suppressing and controlling the working class and cementing the rule of the bourgeoisie. Once it could comfortably be dispensed with, the state would wither away. However, the attempt to bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat to enact world revolution failed. On the last bit now, I promise. Despite the political failure of Marxism, the necessity imminent to capitalism has not gone away. Only the working class no longer has anything to lose but its chains. Has nothing to lose but its chains. Because it could not be positively realized in socialism, the tendency towards immiseration, for example, has had to be circumvented by extra economic measures undertaken by the Bonapartist state as part of the integration of the proletariat into capitalism, and therefore the attempted neutralization of the threat it once posed. This takes place through, say, welfare, through the integration of the unions into the state, through wage laws, through the enshrinement of workers' rights in law, indeed through better living standards. The resultant disappearance of the understanding of class as a political category, really a disappearance of the proletariat as a class for itself, that is, a politically organized class while it still exists in itself, has rendered the Marxist understanding of the proletariat less and less lucid, such that many on the left today want to reduce the question of social class to a question of rich and poor, or to the haves and the have-nots, or the 99% and the 1%, which is the language used by the Occupy movement around which Platypus first grew. In The Holy Family, Marx describes this as the naive relation between rich and poor that has ceased to exist. In the manuscripts, he writes, this antithesis between lack of property and property, so long as it is understood, as long as it is not comprehended as the antithesis of labour and capital, still remains an indifferent antithesis, that is, a mere antagonism that does not point beyond itself, not grasped in its active connection, in its internal relation, not yet grasped as a contradiction. So antagonism and contradiction are not identical. It can find expression in this first form even without the advanced development of private property, as in ancient Rome, Turkey, etc. It does not yet appear as having been established by private property itself. But labour, the subjective essence of private property as exclusion of property, and capital, objective labour as exclusion of labour, constitute private property as its developed state of contradiction, hence a dynamic relationship driving towards resolution. Far from progress, then, far from having left Marxism behind, far from having transcended it, we've continued to fall further and further below it, below its understanding of the necessity of socialism that indeed capitalism is. We are not in an 1848 moment, let alone a 1917 moment. Regression has long been a problem for Marxism. As Catrone writes, beginning in Marx's own lifetime, the form of politics he sought to inspire began to fall well below the threshold of the critically important consciousness of history. And the vast majority of this regression has taken place precisely in the name of Marxism. Throughout the history of Marxism, from the disputes with the anarchists in the First International Working Men's Association and disputes in the Second Socialist International, to the subsequent splits in the Marxist workers' movement with the Bolshevik Third, Communist International and Trotskyist Fourth International, a sometimes heroic but overwhelmingly tragic struggle to preserve or recover something of the initial Marxian point of departure for modern proletarian socialism took place. In the latter half of the 20th century, developments regressed so far behind the original Marxian self-consciousness that Marxism itself became an affirmative ideology of industrial society, and the threshold of post-capitalist society became obscured, finding expression only obtusely in various recrudescent utopian ideologies, and finally, in the most recent period, with the hegemony of anarchist ideologies and romantic rejections of modernity. The tendency to which Marx refers when he describes a dynamic relationship driving towards resolution has therefore been problematized by Marxism's failure as a political project and the subsequent retrogression of society and the regression of the left. While it can be said in a certain sense that this dynamic remains, that capitalism continues to compel socialization and negates itself precisely in doing so, that is, capitalism continues to necessitate socialism, it is also the case that for Marx and Engels, and indeed Lenin, Luxemburg and Trotsky, who had an active, ascendant mass workers' movement to deal with, who enjoyed the very real, very tangible possibility of the political victory of the workers as part of this driving towards resolution, was evident in the workers themselves as constituting and constituted by capitalism. This is to say that capitalism for Marx and the best Marxists did seem to be actively driving beyond itself in the form of the self-conscious subject-object of history, the proletariat. They could, in a sense, be more Hegelian than we are allowed to be. Certainly with the addendum of the final twist of the dialectic identified by Marx and Engels, that is, the way in which the dialectic itself has come to point beyond itself to freedom beyond the dialectic. But nonetheless, the final negation of the negation could be seen by Marxism in its heyday to have been spun out of the dialectic of capitalism itself. In other words, capitalism seems to be passing beyond itself through the agency of the proletarian workers' movement for socialism. The sharpening of the contradictions to which ostensible Marxists today still love to refer was not simply the automatic progress of capitalism where progress may be understood merely as a function of the passage of time, as an inevitability that takes place behind the backs of human beings, condemned only to look on and perhaps be left behind, but the effect of the activity of the workers' movement. Marxism saw itself as the bearer of the historical consciousness of the proletariat, as itself a necessary ingredient in this dynamic, and could trace the history of its movement back through the Industrial Revolution to the days of the utopian socialists. Is this a lineage we can still claim? Can we say that there's been a consistent, not to say linear developing, but nonetheless consistent, workers' movement that we can trace throughout the 20th century and into the 21st? Platypus contends that there is not. Marxism had failed by around 1919 with the murder of the communists Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht during the communist uprisings at the hands of the Free Corps and under the orders of the then ruling SPD, of which they had been an integral part prior to the vote for war credits. It is this uprising that the critical theorist and friend and teacher to Adorno, Walter Benjamin, credits as being the last gasp of the revolution, the last gasp of the truly historical consciousness embodied by Marxism. Soon after came a regression, a reification of the concept of progress that proved fatal. As I tried to explain, Marx and Engels could see the progress of the workers' movement for socialism as the final twist in the dialectic, not as a function of the passage of time, not as an inevitability that must simply be awaited, but as something actively brought about. Benjamin writes, however, in the idea of the classless society, Marx secularized the idea of messianic time. It was only when the Social Democrats, the SPD, elevated this to an ideal that the trouble began. The ideal was defined in neo-Kantian doctrine as an infinite task, and this doctrine was the school of philosophy of the Social Democratic Party. Once the classless society had been defined as an infinite task, the empty and homogeneous time was transformed into an anteroom in which one could wait for the emergence of the revolutionary situation with equanimity. In reality, there is not a moment that would not carry with it its revolutionary chance, provided only that it is defined in a specific way, namely as the chance for a completely new resolution of a completely new problem. For the revolutionary thinker, the peculiar revolutionary chance offered by every historical moment gets its warrant from the political situation. But it is equally grounded in the right of entry which the historical moment plays vis-a-vis a quite distinct chamber of the past, one which up to that point had been closed and locked. The entrance into this chamber coincides in a strict sense with political action, and it is by means of such entry that political action reveals itself as messianic. Classless society is not the final goal of historical progress, but its frequently miscarried, ultimately achieved interruption. Benjamin sheds further light on this last claim with the following remark. Marx says that revolutions are the locomotives of world history, but perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers to activate the emergency brake. So in these apparent deviations from orthodox Marxism, and Benjamin claimed himself to be an orthodox Marxist, lies, in my understanding, the key to recognising what separates our time from Marx's, what necessitates the intervention of the likes of Adorno in his thesis of negative dialectics. Negative dialectics is what becomes of the dialectic of capitalism, absent the workers' movement for socialism, after the political failure and retreat into the university of Marxism. I've insisted throughout this teaching on the negative character of the proletariat for Marxism, and that still stands. But Adorno and Benjamin were contented with preserving the historical dialectic at a time when, as Trotsky put it in 1938's The Transitional Programme, all talk to the effect that historical conditions have not yet ripened for socialism is the product of ignorance or conscious deception. The objective prerequisites for the proletarian revolution have not only ripened, they've begun to get somewhat rotten. Without a socialist revolution in the next historical period at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole culture of mankind. The turn is now to the proletariat, i.e. chiefly to its revolutionary vanguard. The historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership. The progress equated with the dialectical movement of history that Marx and Marxism were still able to regard with hope and expectation because it seemed to have culminated in the revolutionary workers' movement became, after the failure of that movement, merely the continued progress of capitalism, its continued self-negation and reconstitution. This is what Benjamin describes as progression through homogeneous empty time, the progress of prehistory, and the regression of the struggle for emancipation, regression even from the aim of the bourgeois revolutionaries. It is this that Benjamin is referring to when he describes the interruption of historical progress. The point is no longer to progress history, but to throw on the brakes. Louis Menon remarks in his 2003 introduction to Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station that Marxism gave a meaning to modernity. It is said that willingly or not, the individual performs a role in a drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points toward an end, which is the establishment of the classless society. Marxism was founded on an appeal for social justice, but there were many forms that such an appeal might have taken. Its deeper attraction was the discovery of meaning, a meaning in which human beings might participate, in history itself. When Wilson explained, in his introduction to the 1972 edition of To the Finland Station, that his book had been written under the assumption that an important step in progress had been made, that a fundamental breakthrough had occurred, this is the faith he was referring to. Marx and Engels were the philosophers of a second enlightenment. This is a meaning that we no longer have the luxury of falling back on. Now the dialectic itself has come into contradiction with itself, the self-contradiction of self-contradiction. It's violated its own principle of progress in the freedom to become, to transform, and it is the failure of Marxism that produced this condition, a condition we have yet to find a way out of. The dialectic of society, once thought to bind society together through antagonism, through unsocial sociability, once seen as leading beyond itself in the class struggle, the most general form of this antagonism, has now disintegrated into the antinomy of the static and the dynamic reconstitution of the same old thing through what has truly become a war of all against all. It is the old in distress, as Adorno puts it, in its hour of need. But that it needs to be dynamically reconstituted at all, that it can still appear as progress, as dynamism, reveals the dialectic still at work, albeit in a disintegrative, negative form. Society disintegrates under the dead weight of history, and the state is compelled more and more to intervene. Benjamin's notion of the Messiah from outside of progress. It could appear to be something archaic, while nonetheless still driving towards the necessary negation of the negation, an interruption of progress through the realization of what this progress truly means. This is why I think Adorno and Horkheimer describe their work as pre-dialectical in Towards a New Manifesto. It precedes this final push, the final taking up, the final self-overcoming of the dialectic. If we understand the progressive movement of capitalism into a homogeneous future to be one that rides over and leaves as a mere fact of history the attempt to change the world, to realise possibilities we must admit are still latent today, then progressivism itself appears right-wing, conservative. Past attempts at emancipation are allotted their place in the historical continuum, and their failure is accepted at face value, with the judgment that history has placed upon them accepted. As is written in Platypus' State of Purpose, the received wisdom of today dictates that past failed attempts at emancipation stand not as moments full of potential yet to be redeemed, but rather as simply what was, utopianism that was bound to end in tragedy. The Chartist movement, for instance, which Platypus member Ephraim Kalibak gave a great teaching on in Manchester a couple of years ago, came to a dead end. Kalibak pointed out that the huge timeline hanging on the wall of the People's History Museum in Manchester, the Chartist movement is this inconspicuous little branch off the main timeline that came to naught. a rupture treated simply as a fact of the past, incomplete emancipation where capitalism has become complete domination. This must be reversed. It is domination that must be rendered incomplete. It is for this reason that we cannot simply posit even the history of domination as some kind of cynical meaning of history. History as identical with itself, with its own course. These moments of non-identity must be brought out, returned to, redeemed. It is these moments of the non-identity of past and present, the non-identity of history, that Platypus points back to. As Adorno writes in Negative Dialectics, the liquidation of theory by dogmatization and thought taboos contributed to the bad practice. The recovery of theory's independence lies in the interest of practice itself. The interrelation of both moments is not settled once and for all, but fluctuates historically. Those who chide theory for being anachronistic obey the topos of dismissing as obsolete what remains painful because it was thwarted. They thus endorse the world's course. The fact that history has rolled over certain positions will be respected as a verdict on their truth content only by those who agree with Schiller that world history is the world tribunal. What has been cast aside but not absorbed theoretically will often yield its truth content only later. It festers as a sore on the prevailing health. This will lead back to it in changed situations. All that is solid continues to melt into air. Capitalism continues to be nothing other than the unrealized negation of prehistory and the necessity of socialism. Absent the struggle for socialism, this progressive negation takes on simply a destructive character, the culmination of history in a catastrophe whose rubble includes that of abortive struggles for emancipation. As Adorno remarks in the aphorism Les Adieux, orphaned from minimum moralia, airline directors can hold jubilee speeches on how much uncertainty and sorrow people are thereby spared. But the liquidation of parting is a matter of life and death to the traditional notion of humanity. Humanity was the awareness of that not present, which evaporates in a condition which accords all things not present the palpable semblance of presence and immediacy, and hence has only scorn for what finds no enjoyment in such simulation. Yet to insist on parting's inner possibility in face of its pragmatic impossibility would be a lie, for the inward does not unfold within itself, but only in relation to the objective. And to make inward a collapsed outwardness does violence to the inward itself, which is left to sustain itself as if on its own flame. And this is the really crucial bit. A humanity come of age will have to transcend its own concept of the emphatically human positively. Otherwise, its absolute negation, the inhuman, will carry off victory. If capitalism remains the collective, albeit unconscious, product of the working class, if the working class produces, on a global scale, its own conditions of domination, albeit under compulsion, then it still bears the responsibility, actually the only real possibility, of transforming that situation. Then there's still hope. While Marxism discovered the conditions of possibility for socialism in capitalism, this must be understood to include the constitution of the industrial working class and its mass socialist movement, as well indeed as the constitutive role it plays in capitalism. Absent this, capitalism is simply catastrophe. The same energy that goes into reconstituting capitalism could be used to reconstitute the workers' movement for socialism, but it isn't. The workers' movement for socialism is dead. The means of realizing capitalism's latent potential no longer exist in self-conscious political form. Those conditions of possibility are positively decomposing. And yet, for all the failure, for all the backwardness of our own moment, for all the seeming impossibility of redemption, it nonetheless remains the case that, as Adorno has put it, reflections on the character of progress come to a point in the contemplation of whether humanity is capable of preventing catastrophe. The forms of humanity's own global societal constitution threaten its life. If a self-conscious global subject does not develop and intervene, the possibility of, I'll read that again. The forms of humanity's own global societal constitution threaten its life if a self-conscious global subject does not develop and intervene. The possibility of progress, of averting the most extreme, total disaster, has migrated to this global subject alone. Everything else involving progress must crystallize around it. The task of constituting this global subject, which once took the form of the Mass Workers' Party for Socialism, and therefore was not simply identical with the working class itself, remains. In asking if and how this can be resuscitated, in interrogating why it seems to be blocked today, Platypus, as a pre-political project, hopes to play some part in paving the way for the struggle for emancipation to come. We are inadequate to the situation that confronts us, self-consciously so. We refuse to lie about that. Platypus proceeds via negativa. We are not the true Marxists opposed to all the other sects. We maintain the necessity of a positive political program that we, that is the dead left, are incapable of providing. The question, one to which we do not know the answer, is how we get there. Thank you. I don't think we'll get any questions online.
Yeah.
Let's see if it's still actually broadcasting. Yeah.
I would like to have seen. I mean, that was just rambled.
Yeah.
There was a lot there.
Yeah. It's. I was kind of selfish with it because it was like me trying to hash out this stuff for myself, you know, because I'm still confused by a lot of it. So just trying to sort of get together my own understanding of it, and it ended up being like 20 pages. So sorry about that, guys. Yeah, it was long.
Maybe it was good that we didn't have any of the first year philosophy students.
No, I mean, it would have been good. I mean, I'd like a bit of pushback, you know. But yeah. So unless there are any questions from the two,
yeah. So, what's the best one to ask first? All right. You talk about capitalism and bourgeois society.
Mm-hmm.
What's the obviously, I think most people's understanding of the word bourgeois seems to imply capitalism in the first place. So where are we in the constellation now in capitalism and bourgeoisness? So,
as I understand it, capitalism still is bourgeois society, but it's in crisis. So if we date bourgeois society as in its real existence, not necessarily in its political form, but in its real existence, back to the Renaissance, it was actually quite progressive. It was this progressive movement of emancipation. That's not to say that there was no violence or whatever. It was suddenly everyone was free, but it had set its sights on a free civil society, the society of labourers. We can still see sort of like the echoes of this today, even in something like the House of Commons, which we kind of think, oh, you know, it's politicians, MPs or whatever, but that name, the House of Commons, as opposed to the House of Lords, it's the House of the common people. So bourgeois society understood itself to be the emancipation of the common people, the labouring people, rather than the sort of lazy aristocracy. Today, in Marx's understanding, by passing through the Industrial Revolution, which bourgeois society itself brings about, we've entered into this abortive state of transition. So in capitalism, bourgeois society is constantly trying to push beyond itself, but failing to do so because there's no subject to get it beyond itself. So we remain within the bourgeois relations of production in contradiction with the industrial forces of production. Bourgeois simply means urban. So you can see, like, I remember when I first learnt that, and suddenly it was like I understood why Burr was like a common like name in places like Edinburgh or whatever, or the burghers as they call them, Burghers or borough. It's all from the same origin. It's all like etymologically, it's all from the same thing. So it simply means like urban society contrasted with the kind of like courtly society, and also contrasted with earlier warring civilizations. So we couldn't really say, for instance, that there was pre-bourgeois society. Society, as we understand it, is bourgeois. The fact that we live in society is itself a product of bourgeois revolution. Before that, there were only warring, isolated civilizations, growing more and more. So we also say that history only becomes dialectical in bourgeois society. So when Hegel talks about the dialectic of history, it's not this thing that's going back to like hunter-gatherers. It's something that takes all the development that has already taken place in traditional civilization, and that enters into the dialectic in bourgeois society, if that makes sense, because that prior development is appropriated. But there's also the question there, I suppose, of like, where we are today also invokes the question of proletarianization. And in the Adorno understanding, you've got this idea that all of society is proletarianized. So we first see this in, like, I think it's in one of the Luxembourg texts that we read in the reading group. She talks about how rather than it being individual capitalists who own things, who own capital, that's become now combinations of capitalists. And now it's like, could we even say it's that? Like, do individual capitalists own capital? Or is capital itself this kind of like reified thing to them? It's like, I think Adorno has a phrase, reified even to itself. In other words, the capitalists are also fungible, replaceable. They're not out there sort of like at one with the role they have in society. They're reduced to their function. They're a function of capital. So they're dominated by capital. And in the way I've heard Chris talk about it, that's what makes them also proletarianized. In a different way, to be clear, but nonetheless. And that's actually Adorno sees potential in that. Because he says, like, well, if the whole of society is becoming proletarianized, then maybe it is going to get to the point where we can all sort of just look on our own sort of social constitution as this object, and that has emancipatory potential as well. Anyway, yeah. That helps.
So I guess I'm kind of asking because so in terms of like, the left is dead, how do you revive the left? Is there like maybe for the 21st century a necessity to kind of shed off like 60s progressivism, if that makes sense? Yeah,
definitely.
Go beyond it, maybe.
Yeah, and the same perhaps is true of Marxism. Like, in Platypus, we say, like, there's this Marxism as a political project kind of comes into crisis and then ends up failing around 1919. And then there's the 60s attempt with the New Left to revive that and gain a new understanding of it, which also comes to naught. And we've inherited that. We've inherited that kind of progressivism, and a lot of the movements today sort of like date from that. But it might also be the case that if there is going to be a reconstituted left, a reconstituted workers' movement, that it might also go beyond Marxism, and it might be able to shed Marxism, and it might develop something genuinely new. Which also means that Platypus itself might not be able to recognise it if that ever does arise. It might take us by surprise as well, because it might be something just completely unrecognisable, or that appears to be, as I say, reactionary, archaic, whatever.
Okay, third question, I guess a bit more technical, but you say like antagonism and contradiction being different things. Which one's which?
So antagonism is just kind of like, as I understand it, it's so Marx talks about how you get the antagonism between rich and poor, even in, say, Rome or whatever, or Turkey, ancient Rome or ancient Turkey. That's just, that doesn't necessarily point beyond itself. He's not understanding that as a dialectic, as like what he talks about as being mutually interpenetrated opposites. I think I've got that phrase right. So contradiction, it's not like the contradiction of two separate things, for example. It's not like a thesis and an antithesis. Or if it is, it's that the antithesis exists in the thing itself. So the contradiction of labour and capital, which takes phenomenal form in the struggles between bourgeoisie and proletariat, is actually expressing the self-contradiction of bourgeois society and capitalism. It's the division of the third estate into two opposing classes. So as I say, these guys thought that these guys thought that they were going towards a classless society, and then it ends up in the most perfect class society there's ever actually been. The real production of social class for the first time, rather than castes. So like the estates, they understood themselves not as classes, but as estates, as castes, as divinely ordained. So I think that's what sets it apart. So contradiction is the sort of the dynamic that points beyond itself, that has progressive emancipatory potential, whereas antagonism is just simply sort of like coming to blows. It's not necessarily got potential to it. It's just sort of antagonism, if that makes sense. That's how I understand it. Rebecca's just said something. Rebecca makes a good point. This distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism, it's there in Marx, and you can see it in certain places. Like he talks about bourgeois society, I think it's in the manuscripts, he says bourgeois society, but more or less in capitalist form. But he does use them interchangeably. We really insist on that in Platypus because it seems to have become this blind spot, because the way I've heard Chris talk about it is that people telescope these moments together. So rather than talking about this emancipatory moment in bourgeois society, this moment of like genuine progress in freedom, capitalism is just sort of telescoped back, and we just get either this idea of there's always been domination, which is nonetheless true, it's just exploitation, it's just this, that, the other, which might then result in capitalism being reduced to exploitation, which it can't be. There's more to it than that. Or, as someone said to me a couple of weeks ago, that prior to the colonialism that begins in bourgeois civilization, we had socialism, which I guess that what they're talking about there is like this idea of primitive communism, maybe. But I think it's also this idea that like exploitation, oppression, all the ills from which we suffer today date only from that point. And in a certain sense they do, but there's a deeper history to it as well. That's why Marx can talk about all history being the history of class struggles. That's why we can talk about prehistory, the prehistory of mankind, which we're still within. We're still within that prehistory, but maybe on the transitional moment to get out of it, maybe. Yeah, so I guess to tie all my questions like kind of together maybe, but if you so the distinction with like bourgeois and class struggle, as far as I understand, a lot of other theorists are kind of having this idea that the bourgeois are staying, but that capitalism is not. Well, that it's not capitalism anymore. So you get like a lot of this, like, you know, like the West doesn't have a real working class anymore, just in terms of like we don't produce our own stuff or whatever. And so the implication kind of seems to be, well, there's like Yanis Varoufakis has this techno-feudalism, and there's like like postmodern neo-Marxists, which is kind of why I asked about shedding the 60s progressivism. But so when, I guess, why is it that, or at least what I seem to be getting from you, is that capitalism is advancing, but bourgeois society isn't. And like, is there tension with then the opposite idea, like I was saying, that it's no longer capitalism, but that we still have the bourgeois? Because those do seem like ideas at odds with each other. So I'll clarify a couple of things there, actually. When we say bourgeois, we're not talking necessarily about the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie sort of emerges like and this goes back to one of your earlier questions. The bourgeoisie emerges from out of the wealthier end of the third estate. So you have like the poor commoners and the wealthy commoners who eventually become the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But the proletariat is a bourgeois class. It's an urban class. So when I talk about like progress in capitalism, it is the dynamic reconstitution of the same old thing. So the dynamic that people talk about as being progress, the thing that makes capitalism seem to be actually going somewhere, is actually really just this continued abortive transition out of bourgeois society. So it's the reproduction of bourgeois social relations on a capitalist basis or within capitalism. So when people talk about techno-feudalism, I suppose there are two sides to that, because you also get the kind of like libertarians who talk about it and say it's not real capitalism, because real capitalism is like the free market, Adam Smith and all that. And there's a grain of truth to that, because of course this is what we're kind of talking about with bourgeois society, what they imagine it was going to be. Individual producers in the free market, free labourers who own their own means of production and the product of their labour. but where it's ended up, it's like what we're trying to say is that maybe Benjamin's phrase here is helpful. Dialectics at a standstill. So it's the self-negation of the dialectic. It's not this progress in freedom. It's movement, but it's the movement insofar as we're just reproducing the same old thing because it continues to destroy itself. And it does render it unintelligible, and it does problematize it. And as you say, can we say we've really got a working class anymore, the producers of capital? Well, I mean, I think so. I think there are producers of capital. Maybe there are fewer sort of manual labourers who are like directly producing goods now in the West, but I think there are still sort of like proletarianized producers of capital, whereby what you're producing confronts you as an alien object and all that stuff that Marx talks about in the manuscripts. But this is what I was trying to get at as well with it's something that comes from Adorno. I think it's in Reflections on Class Theory, when he says that the proletariat no longer has nothing to lose but its chains, because of it's been integrated into capitalism. And of course, then you also get the phrase, I think from Lenin, the labour aristocracy, I think he calls it. So that you've got like the wealthier members of the proletariat who do benefit from the exploitation of poorer members of the proletariat. But the point would be, insofar as your position in society, your sort of the standpoint of you as a proletarian, are you producing capital, and therefore are you producing capital which is a social relation, and thus are you producing society? Do you contribute to the production of society? And if it's true that we do contribute to the production of society, which isn't necessarily like literally direct physical production of goods, is there still a chance that we could produce society in a different form? Could we produce the totality differently? Or could we produce it self-consciously? Could we come to consciousness of what we're actually already doing in capitalism, which is imposing on ourselves the necessity of the transition from out of capitalism? What would it take to bring that to a kind of general global consciousness? For Marxism, it was the mass proletarian workers' party, the global party, the international. Today, it's less clear, because there have been attempts to get a new international going for decades now. There are, I don't know how many different groups claim themselves to be the Fourth International. Keir made the relation earlier to Life of Brian, the Judean People's Front, the People's Front of Judea, all these different sort of groupuscules and sects who are claiming to be the true Marxists, the true inheritors of Trotsky, the true Fourth International. And really, it's just, I don't know, it's kind of a hobby, I guess. And Platypus is the same, you know, Platypus is a sect, it's cut off from the working class, but we're kind of like conscious, or we hope to be conscious of our own negativity in that sense. We're not trying to claim to be the guys with the true knowledge. We're just sort of saying, this is a real obstacle that we need to get past if we're going to do something about this shit, basically. And maybe we can't anymore, and that's one of the things Chris says, maybe that moment has been and gone. And maybe this is just the catastrophe of world history. And that's it. There's no getting beyond it. The potential has been missed. The moment has been missed. Maybe that's also true. Which is depressing, but maybe it's true. Does that help at all?
Yeah. Pretty much clears everything up.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, question did pop into my mind, and it's something that Chris has said, and I could be misquoting, but he said there's this idea that the rich people have the money and the poor people don't, and what's happening is that the rich people are taking the poor people's money, but he goes that that's not the correct understanding. He sort of laughed and moved on to a different point, and I think you might have said something a little that sparked that in my head.
Yeah, there's Marx thing on that. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Okay, yeah. That if you comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes from, at least in part, comes from Marx's criticism or critique of Proudhon, because of course Proudhon has that famous phrase, like wage labour is theft, or something like property is theft, all property is theft.
Oh yeah.
Marx takes this to task in the manuscripts, And he says that no, it's like wages are actually a deduction from capital. This is not the property of the working class. And what Marx is doing there is he's not affirming